On this episode of the Montana Majority Report, I was pleased to speak with Michael Farris, a constitutional scholar, founder of Patrick Henry College, former president of Alliance Defending Freedom, and the Legal Defense Fund, which he founded. He's also the co-founder of Convention of States. Just an outstanding man, scholar, and attorney, and we were just pleased to have him with us today.
Ready, set, showtime. Welcome to the Montana Majority Report. Quick, transparent, and informative. Get the inside scoop on policies, people, and decisions shaping our state, all in less time than it takes to pour your morning coffee. Stay tuned. Montana starts right here.
Michael, it's great to have you in Montana, what I would consider one of the freest states in the Union, and certainly one of the most beautiful and funnest.
Well, Tommy, it's an honor to be here. I was here in the state capitol approximately 30 years ago, helping to move the Montana homeschool bill through and fight for freedom on that score. And I loved the atmosphere then. I love the atmosphere today. This is a great state. I'm a little jealous. If you were closer to my grandkids, I'd probably move to Montana. But the grandkid thing keeps me in Virginia.
I get that. Hey, I want to talk to you a little about Convention of States. That's why you're here. You know, I got involved in the Convention of States project about 5 years ago. A constituent came to me and asked me if I had thought about it before, and I said, yeah, I voted no on all Article 5 resolutions back in the House. But he asked me to look at the material. I looked it over, and I kind of went down that rabbit hole, and as a fiscal conservative, I just had that epiphany that said this is the only solution. And can you take off on that and tell us why you got involved and how? And
Sure. Well, I kind of went through the same process a few years before that.
Yeah.
To some degree, I got involved with Article 5 the first time in 1977 when Congress was monkeying with the rules on the Equal Rights Amendment. It was supposed to have 7 years for ratification, and even though in order to act on the Constitution, Congress needs 2/3 majority vote in both houses, they purported to change the rules for ratification by a 2/3 majority, and beyond that, you just can't change the rules in the middle of the stream.
Right.
So I filed the first lawsuit in the country challenging the constitutionality of what Congress was doing in that. And as a consequence of that, I'm one of the few lawyers that's ever actually litigated an Article 5 case. We won that case in the federal district court, and then the second deadline timed out at the Supreme Court, and they said it was moot. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Article 5. But in the meantime, I was defending homeschoolers for many years and teaching Patrick Henry College's constitutional law courses. And as I was teaching constitutional law especially, I was teaching about how the government spends too much money in violation of the original meaning of the Commerce Clause. Of course, the Supreme Court has interpreted the Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause inappropriately. And both the Commerce Clause, which is the conduit for government regulation, and the General Welfare Clause, which is the conduit for government spending, it's just all out of control, all out of whack. And I was thinking, how do we fix this? How do we fix the problem? It's particularly the fiscal problems that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And you know, as I looked back at Article 5, I remembered the Article 5 then, back from the late 70s. And I said, well, you know, the states can do it. In fact, George Mason at the end of the Constitutional Convention, I wasn't quite alive then. I was, you know, I dated his granddaughter maybe or something. I don't know. But Mason said at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Congress will never propose an amendment that limits its own power, that we need to give the states the ability to limit the power of Congress, because the number one thing, biblical principle that the founders believed that was applied to government, they believed lots of biblical principles. The number one application was men are sinners. And you can't trust anybody with too much power because everybody's a sinner. So nobody's perfectible, but if we have one group of sinners checking another group of sinners, that's our best path to freedom and protecting our God-given liberties. And so they wanted the states to have the ability to decide ultimately how much power Congress had. And so that's why they gave us the Convention of States model for the very day that we're living in, where there's a massive abuse of power, particularly fiscal issues, but other things as well. And that we need to step up. And so I started these conversations on my Facebook page, and my Facebook page conversations became the Convention of States project.
So, when you look at the Convention of States application, which is an application for a Convention of States to propose amendments under Article 5, tell us what the application says and what it's attempting to accomplish.
Sure. There are 3 topics that are, the technical term is germane, which is like setting an agenda for a meeting. That's what we're doing at this stage, is saying, what can we lawfully talk about? And so the 3 things we can lawfully talk about are fiscal restraints on the federal government, which would be a combination of limiting tax increases, limiting spending, and a balanced budget provision. That's fiscal restraints. Then term limits on federal officials, which would be term limits on members of Congress and senior officials like Dr. Fauci. And the third is restrictions on the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. For example, Congress has the power to pack the Supreme Court right now. Well, we could take that away to say Congress no longer has the power. We're going to fix 9 as the permanent number of Supreme Court justices, which would take away their power to play games with the Supreme Court. And so that would be an example. And another example there would be requiring Congress to pass bills under what most states operate under is a single subject rule. You can't pack all kinds of different subjects into one bill, have 3,000-page bills with all this nonsense in it. Single subject rule would really go a long way to having better government and less government in Washington, D.C. So those are the 3 topics that we're calling for a Convention of States. 19 states have passed our resolution verbatim, and we need to get to 34 to be able to have a convention. And ultimately, 38 states have to ratify whatever comes out.
Yeah, I want to talk about the ratification process a little bit later, but I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about those 3 issues that you discussed. The fiscal issue is probably top of my list, although all 3 of them are critical in my mind. But, the federal government, Congress, has deficit spent close to $2 trillion last fiscal year. And looking at another $2 trillion this fiscal year. The most alarming part of all that to me is spending $1.1 trillion on debt service, which is almost 40% of our income tax revenue. Can you just talk a little bit about, in your mind, what happens when, 10 years from now and that debt is $60 trillion and the debt service is 60% of all revenue? What do you see happening to this country? What are some of the dangers and threats?
Well, there has to be some form of economic collapse eventually. The only way you can, ultimately pay that is to devalue the currency so bad, or inflate the value of the currency so much. So, I'm 73 and I've got a certain amount of money saved up for the rest of my life. Well, if the amount of money I saved up now represents the cost of a used car, because you've inflated the money, then everybody's life savings is basically wiped out. At least all the ordinary people's savings are wiped out. All of our net value is wiped, and all because the only way you pay off $60 trillion is to say that the minimum wage is $1 million an hour, or something like that. Yeah. And so like Zimbabwe has had $10 billion pieces of currency. It gets into that kind of nonsense. You collapse the economy is what it amounts to.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing for you and I to say that we lost our life savings, or the people in our age group. Another thing to say that your grandchildren, because we're fiscally vulnerable and our military doesn't have the money to have a national defense that's substantive, that's our grandchildren that are in the war to save this union and essentially fight for our freedoms all over again.
Yeah, some form of collapse has to happen. We either have to have an economic collapse or a political collapse or a constitutional collapse or all of the above. Yeah. And so we're asking for an absolute, and I have 10 kids and 31 grandkids and 1 great-grandchild and another great-grandchild on the way. So, their world is not going to be the world that we've lived in unless we do something pretty quickly. I think we've got about 4 or 5 years that we really can put the brakes on and start rolling it back. We'll not ratchet it all the way back instantaneously. But if we don't put the brakes on and there's no hope for a go-forward basis, it's going to blow up or go off the cliff, or pick the black hole, whatever you want. Some form of disaster will arise.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that middle one, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Out here in Montana, we're independent. We want to manage our own coal, our own air, our own water, our own wildlife. We don't need the federal government telling us how to manage our environment or what we do with our grizzly bear or sage grouse and a host of myriad of other issues, even to the point of what kind of light bulb we screw in our sockets in our house, or the dishwasher we use, or the dryer that we have, ad nauseum. What do you think that maybe a potential amendment that could rein in the power of the federal government and give states back more of their sovereignty?
Well, there's two things that would fix every single one of those problems that you've just outlined, because all those bad provisions came either through the Commerce Clause or the General Welfare Clause, one or the other. Mm-hmm. And both of them originally meant essentially the same thing. The General Welfare Clause, basically the question is, can Congress spend money on things that are outside of its enumerated powers? And the Supreme Court in the 1930s said yes. Mm-hmm. That was the open door. The proper understanding of the General Welfare Clause is this: if the states can spend money on the topic, Congress cannot. Mm-hmm. So if the states can spend money on education, which they can, Congress cannot. Can the states spend money on welfare? Yes. Congress cannot. Can the states spend money on mining issues? Yes. Congress cannot. Mm-hmm. The same thing is true for Commerce Clause. Commerce Clause was the regulation of interstate shipping. States cannot regulate interstate commerce. That's absolutely clear. It's beyond debate. No constitutional scholar would disagree with that point. The question is banking interstate commerce? No, because states can and do regulate banking. The Uniform Commercial Code is the basic regulation of banking. That's a state law. All 50 states passed the same law. They agreed to do it. Yeah. And so can the states regulate manufacturing? Yes. It's not commerce. It's banking. It's shipping. Commerce is shipping. That's it. It's just shipping. So the amendments would be to say Congress cannot spend money on things that are within the jurisdictional competence of the states, period. That's all you have to say.
That's a great amendment. Yeah. That would solve all those problems.
Yeah, and the other one, Congress cannot regulate activity under the name of interstate commerce other than interstate shipments.
Mm. Yeah, that would do a lot. Just those first two amendment ideas would solve huge amount of problems, particularly keep our fiscal house from collapsing and give states back what we originally had in the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about term limits before we move on. But, I think a lot of people, when you ask them about term limits, that's probably a 90% issue, and they see some geriatric patients teetering around Congress. And how do you see term limits? You mentioned also federal officials impacting the welfare of our states and our government in general.
Well, I believe that we were intended to be a citizen legislature and a citizen-run government, not a professional class of managers. And when you can make a lifetime career out of running the government, it's not a good thing. And it becomes your in fact, there's an analogy here that one of the secretaries of state under 50 years ago or so would bring in all the ambassadors into his office that were being appointed, and he would spin the globe and say, stop the globe when it gets to your country. And they would, if they were the ambassador to France, they'd stop it on France or Portugal or whatever. And he'd say, no. You'd stop it on America. That's your country. Your job is not to represent France to the United States. Your job is to represent the United States to France. And so the people in Washington, D.C. think their job is to represent Washington, D.C. back to the people back home. It's the other way around. Mm-hmm. They're to represent the people back home to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, good point.
And they've become, that's their peer group. They've lived there, they work there, that's their peer group. That's who they hang out with. Retired congressmen rarely go home. They live in the Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah, good point. Some people might say, why don't you just have Congress do this? They have that power to propose amendments. What's your take on that? Just have Congress pass a fiscal restraint amendment of some sort?
Well, I'd love it if they'd do it. They won't do it.
Yeah.
And the reason they won't do it is human nature. They will never restrict their own power. You just can't get, and because it's 2/3 majority in both houses, there's occasional winds that would blow through. You might get a simple majority on one of those ideas. You can't get a 2/3 majority. It just will not happen. And so, I've been working in Washington, D.C. I mean, I could be accused of being one of those people that stay. Although I live on a dirt road 50 miles away looking at the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I have a cabin in the Allegheny Mountains beyond that. So I think I've retained some semblance of sanity.
Yeah.
But I've been there, worked there a long time, and seen a lot of really good people come in. It's just as much of a mess as it was. It's worse of a mess. And the conservative movement is certainly better than it was 40 years ago. So the idea that we will improve things in Washington, D.C. is a fairy tale.
I think that's true. I think Reagan tried multiple times to get a balanced budget amendment and had it in the Senate, lost in the House, had it in the House, lost in the Senate. And I think he said famously that Congress will not discipline itself. It's got to come from the states if we're going to see something. So that was kind of a leading question. It's really in your mind, in my mind too, the state legislatures have to do something. So let's talk about our responsibility here as state legislators and what we need to do really to save the nation. It's not a hyperbole that we're saying that. It's absolute truth.
Absolutely, yes. Well, the Constitution gives the state governments, particularly the state legislatures,
Right.
the power to amend the Constitution unilaterally. But it takes 38 states ultimately. There's 3 stages. 34 states have to call for a convention on a particular topic. We're at 19 on the one that you and I are working on.
Right.
Then they hold a convention on those topics, and you draft the actual amendments. And I've given you some examples of what those would look like. And then it's a simple majority there. So 26 states would vote in favor of the texts, and then they're now official proposals. They're not adopted. They're proposals.
Right.
Then it goes to the states, and when 3/4 of the states, which is 38, 3/4 of the states ratify, then they're a part of the Constitution. And so 3 state legislatures. Now, it could be state ratification conventions, but that's not going to happen. So we'll just call it what it's 99% certain going to happen. State legislatures are going to have to ratify. And so that's the process. It will take it'll take us a minimum of 3 more years to get to 34. If everything fell together right in 2025, we might get 3, 4, 5, 6 more states. And if with that kind of momentum, then I think we could really in the next 2 or 3 years get to 34. And then we could have the convention, and then we start ratifying another 6 months after that. So within 3 to 5 years, we could get all this stuff done. And it's got to get done because the future of the country, the time to act is now, and it's just getting so bad.
You said something in a meeting I was at last night. You asked the question: all this debt, all this deficit, all this dysfunction in Congress, and we look at those guys and we say they're totally dysfunctional. They're spending us into a hole we'll never get out of. It's their fault.
Right.
Can you go back?
Yeah, thank you for prompting me to that on that as well. Yeah. Well, it is their fault, but it's also the fault of the state legislatures because it's really pretty close to this analogy. You got the teenagers in Washington, D.C., and the parents are in the state legislature because they can pull the plug. The Article 5 process, the Convention of States process, gives the state legislatures collectively the ability to take their credit card away and stop them dead in their tracks. And so if you've got the authority under the Constitution to do it, I believe you have the moral responsibility before God and before your constituents to do so.
Yeah.
Because, is there a problem? Yes. Do you have the ability to do something about it? Yes. And if you don't do something about it, are you responsible for your failure to act? Yeah, well, the book of James says if you know to do right and do it not, to you it is sin. Well, I'm contending, I think it's actually sinful for state legislators to let this mess in Washington, D.C. They are sinning against the future of our kids at a minimum. And I think that they're sinning it's sins of omission. People in Washington, D.C. are sins of commission, but these are sins of omission in the state legislature. It's still a sin.
It's a tremendous responsibility we have, and we have to act on the authority we've been given through Article 5 of the United States Constitution.
That's exactly right.
Well, I've obviously been involved in this some time and talked to many, many people about it and persuaded a lot of people that this is something we ought to do. But sometimes I get pushback. They say, well, Tom, that's maybe a good idea, but I don't know if it'll work. It'll run away and they'll propose crazy amendments and you have no control over that convention, and ad nauseum on that line of thinking. What would you say to the person that says this won't work, it's going to run away, and it's going to make it worse than it was before?
Okay. Well, the it won't work is a little different than a runaway, but I'll hit both of them.
Okay,
Let's do the runaway first, and then we'll do the it won't work.
Yeah.
There are legal reasons that the runaway can't happen, and there are political reasons. The political reason is the easiest one, and is kind of, in a sense, the ultimate one. Whatever comes out of the convention, and let's say that it's not a runaway, but it's just a bad idea. We have a balanced budget amendment that comes out, and you could read it and say, well, yeah, we'll balance the budget, but we'll do so by raising taxes to this incredible level. Well, that's a bad idea. And so bad ideas, whether they're germane, meaning on topic or off topic, right. 38 states have to vote yes, 38 state legislatures, both houses. So if you get stupid ideas from the right, stupid ideas from the left, runaway ideas from the right, they all have, no matter what they are, all have to get 38 states to vote for it. The one I most commonly hear is they'll get rid of the Second Amendment. Well, no. 25 or so states, maybe it's 26, but in the 20s have constitutional carry laws. Do you think you can get 38 states to vote to ban the Second Amendment, get rid of the Second Amendment? If we start with, all these gun-loving states, they ain't going to happen. It's just basic legislative math says that cannot happen. Just like, people will say, well, they'll get rid of Social Security. There's not 38 states that will approve getting rid of Social Security. It's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen.
And so no matter what somebody thinks about that, it's just politically unrealistic in the extreme. So that's the ultimate answer. But the legal answer is this: 49 states currently have applications pending. They've been adopted since 1788. 49 states pending. Lots of different topics. We've never had 2/3 of the states agree on the same topic. So you've got to agree on the topic to get going. So if you have to agree on the topic to get going, the question is, can you change the topic afterwards? Well, no. The case I litigated on the ERA answers that question. You can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. If you call it for topic X, you can't pass amendments on topic Y. I will personally sue. I did it before when I was a very young lawyer. I was 2 years out of law school. I sued and I won. I'm now 48 years out of law school, and I've argued and won 2 Supreme Court cases since then. And I guarantee you, I will sue and win. And if I'm dead, I have had 6 of my students that I taught at Patrick Henry College that have clerked for the Supreme Court of the United States. And I guarantee you at least one of them will take up the cudgel, if not 100 other lawyers, including the Attorney General of Montana. That cannot happen legally. It cannot happen politically. It just is nonsense. If you just apply any standard of realism to it. But if you want to know how we could really lose the Second Amendment, here's how it could happen. We won the idea that the Second Amendment was a personal right by a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court about 25 years ago, the D.C. versus Heller case. You switch that vote by 1 vote, and the alternative theory is that the Second Amendment is only for militias, meaning the National Guard. Mm-hmm. And so it's not an individual right. Now, you let the Democrats get control of both houses of Congress and the presidency. The next time this comes around, they're going to pack the Supreme Court. That will happen. I know people that have served on Biden's Supreme Court commission. Yeah. And that will happen. I pretty well guarantee it. And if you pack the Supreme Court, D.C. versus Heller will be reversed as soon as they can get a case in front of them. And that's how you really can, get rid of the Second Amendment. That's a very realistic scenario. And the Convention of States is the only thing that guarantees you we stop that, because we can stop the court packing by an amendment that says there are exactly 9 justices on the Supreme Court. No packing. No packing.
Yeah, so in the final analysis, you've got to have 38 states. that means you can only lose 13 or 12 or whatever the number is.
13. If you lose 13, you're done.
Yeah, so it's almost impossible. Matter of fact, I think I read that a lot of the framers and the founders were saying they liked Article 5 and the idea of a convention for the states to propose amendments, but they thought this is just too hard.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it's hard. I actually wish it was just 2/3 rather than 3/4. I think that, but I'll take it as it is.
Yeah.
It is 3/4. And unless the vast majority of Americans agree with an idea, it's not going to get 38 states. And so the idea that we, the people, are writing the Constitution is sustained by requiring 38 states, because you really have to have the kind of thing that 65-70% of the American public like the idea, or else it's not going to pass.
Let's just wrap this up and just want to talk about what you would like to see the state of Montana do. I'll share with my thoughts, but we're really close here in Montana to actually being that 20th state to pass the Article 5 resolution to have those three topics addressed: fiscal restraint, limit the power and jurisdiction term limits on its officials and members of Congress. What would be your parting words to the legislators of the state of Montana and the people?
Well, please do this. This is so important for the sake of our kids, for the sake of our grandkids, and I can start now talking for the sake of our great-grandkids. By the way, my first great-grandchild is named Mitchell. For the sake of Mitchell, we've got to do this.
Yeah.
And we can do something to preserve liberty, and we just need a few more votes. So the people, call your legislators and ask them to vote for Convention of States. Legislators, do your responsibility. Defend us against the people in Washington that are abusing the people of Montana.
Do your duty. Thank you, Mr. Farris.